All right. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar with Twan Leenders and Frank. I'm sorry, Frank, you have to pronounce your last name for us.
Izaguirre is fine, no problem.
Okay, Izaguirre. The Roger Tory Peterson Institute is happy to bring this program to everybody. If you're not familiar with the Roger Tory Peterson Institute, we're in Jamestown, New York. If you've ever heard of the Peterson Field Guides, then you've heard of Roger Tory Peterson, the father of the modern field guide, who helped make birding a thing in the United States and worldwide. And so Twan and Frank are here to talk about, in fact, field guides. And so what you just missed at Roger Tory Peterson Institute was a wonderful exhibition that brought together the field guide art and papers and sketches of Roger Tory Peterson and David Allen Sibley side by side, which was just incredible to see. And hopefully we'll be able to resurrect pieces of that and have it sent around to different places. David Sibley was quite honored to have his works next to Roger Tory Peterson's works. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Twan Leenders. Twan?
Thank you, George. Glad to be here. The exhibit was amazing. The work of Roger Tory Peterson is obviously amazing. And I know that we've, for years, and personally myself too, we've often had conversations with all kinds of people about why field guides do what they do. You know, there's so many books about nature. There's so many books about birds. And frankly, there are even so many different field guides, even just about birds. And some, like the Peterson guides, became hugely influential and have really spurred an entire generation of birders and naturalists. And Sibley's guides really are sort of the next generation of that. And not to say that there haven't been other successful guides, but the notion that we need to get people connected to nature more so now, I think, than ever. The challenge of doing that and doing that right is really interesting because it's been done, right? Roger Tory Peterson came out of nowhere, created the first real general public field guide, and it became a huge seller, and it really got people excited about this. So the notion that these kind of tools are out there, and the notion that there are ways to just really engage a broad audience, I think is super important right now. So I'm really excited to have Frank here because I know that he's been interested in the same topics, but he's also actually formally studying the concept of why field guides are so effective, right? So Frank is an editor at the American Birding Association, but he's also a graduate student, and you're not done yet, right? Or are you done at this point?
No, I'm still finishing up the dissertation. That's
still
correct.
Working on that? I wasn't sure if I should ask you that or not. But yeah, so Frank has clearly been, professionally and personally really interested in the topic, and I'm really excited to have him here and have him share with all of us his research and his personal experiences as well. So welcome, Frank.
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's see. Should I turn on my PowerPoint? Should I make it my screen? Is that okay? Let's see. Is that something I can do?
Let me see if
I can just talk otherwise.
No, you should be able to do that. Let me see if I can make you a co-host. I'm not sure if George is still here. Oh, yep, George is still here. Yeah, you should be a co-host, so you should be
share
able
screen.
To do so.
Okay. Sure. Does that look good?
Coming. There it is. Wonderful.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so hello, I'm Frank. Twan, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm thrilled and honored to be able to speak with everyone today. So I'm now one of the editors of Birding Magazine while I finish my PhD in English at West Virginia University, as Twan mentioned. So what I've been doing there is I've been dissertating on field guides and their influence on environmental thinking, which is what I'm speaking about now. So my presentation is kind of like a distillation of various sections of my research. And the way I've organized my project is not just by trying to produce a history of field guides, although there's a lot of history involved. What I've done is at the center of my research, I've placed a question. It's like my research question, which is, what do field guides do? And I'm always trying to answer that question. So now, if we try to answer that question, maybe without thinking too much or just giving sort of like an instinctive answer, we might say something like, field guides help us identify things like birds or reptiles or wildflowers, and that's true. But in broad terms, what I argue in my research is that field guides do more than help people identify things. Field guides shape the way we conceptualize and interact with the world and the environment around us and the different living things and non-living entities around us. So when we think about nature, we think about nature through field guides. Field guides mold the way we conceive of birds and everything else that we encounter in environmental spaces. And even more than that, field guides are exercises in power and sometimes competing ideologies even. Okay, so field guides. What's a field guide anyway? One of the funny things about field guides is that if you're trying to define what a field guide is, for those of us who are familiar with the genre and even people who aren't, it's surprisingly hard to come up with a definition of field guides that encompasses all kinds of field guides. Field guides are so unbelievably popular and such a successful genre and concept, which is the main reason why I really wanted to do this project, that there are field guides for an almost unbelievably different array of things. There are field guides for sailboats, aircraft, arrowheads, trains, antique furniture, anthropological artifacts, architecture. There is even a field guide to hot sauces. So even though the notion of a field guide is fairly plastic, we all have a sense of what a field guide should look like, even if it's about hot sauces. So at the same time, there are novels that call themselves field guides. There's poetry that calls itself a field guide. There are memoirs, literary criticism, even feature stories and celebrity gossip articles that call themselves field guides. Sometimes those forms are borrowing the term and using it in more of like a creative sense, but it can be hard to know or exactly define where media that labels itself a field guide is lampooning or riffing off the concept of field guide, and when something genuinely is presenting as a field guide. So where did all this come from? This sense of what a field guide is, or what the concept of a field guide communicates to potential readers. Now, I'm going to go a little back in time and talk about the emergence of field guides. If we really want to fully trace the evolution of the genre, which is basically a branch of natural history writing, we have to go really far back in time, and I do that in my dissertation. I start writing about Assyrian panels and cuneiform tablets, Aristotle and Theophrastus, medieval herbals and bestiaries, all of these mediums of depicting what we think of as natural history, which typically balance scientific knowledge with artistry. These works have all influenced the way we conceive of the natural world today and eventually resulted in the emergence of the field guide. The most immediate predecessors to field guides, which I refer to sometimes as proto-field guides, are natural history texts that were popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the United States, the first book like this was Mark Catesby's The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, which was published over various years starting in 1729 and ending in 1741. Okay, so Catesby's Natural History of Carolina and books that followed by authors like Alexander Wilson, John James Audubon, who I'm going to talk about more, and others looked in many ways like a field guide. They were the first book-length attempts to catalog nature in America as a series of illustrations based on floral and faunal units at the taxonomic level of species. Attention, which notes that more or less equally draw attention to the natural history of the species, with instructions for future recognition of the species and its relative place in taxonomic structure. The language is straightforward and descriptive in a minimalistic way. And all that may sound somewhat familiar. That's why I refer to these books in my project as proto-field guides. So who was Mark Catesby and why did he like nature so much? Why did he write this book? Why did he illustrate natural history of Carolina? Well, the simple answer is that he was a nobleman with connections, and the purpose for his work to study and illustrate American natural history was to name, classify, and describe the plants and wildlife of the colonies of England. So more specifically, and as some other scholars have argued, one of natural history of Carolina's most main purposes was to serve as a justification for one of the British Empire's most infamous enterprises, the plantation economy. So the rise of natural history study in the Americas and the emergence of the plantation system, those were two inextricably linked events, because early natural history writing was preoccupied with the potential of exploiting the new landscape of the Americas. Now, in several of his paintings, Catesby emphasizes the general debauchery and vulgarity of Carolinian nature. So Catesby's rendering of the landscape of the Carolinas, which changed considerably during his time there, which was 1722 to 1726, is of a landscape changing from pestilential swamp to a productive plantation, justifying the recent expansion of slave plantations in the region. So by demonstrating that the importance of African slaves and the transformation of the land from swampland to plantation was an improvement, the imperial enterprise was justified using both scientific and economic terms. So here's a good example of how Carolinian nature, was depicted was depicted as turbulent and tumultuous, a morally degenerate location with rapid botanical transformations in the form of rice plantations were improving. Catesby's rendering of the cottonmouth, which he calls the brown viper, poised to devour a hapless newt. The viper is super vicious looking, with tiny, sinister eyes and sharp fangs, powerfully coiled muscles filling the image. It's implied that the swamps of Catesby and Carolina were hostile and filled with dangerous reptiles and are in need of European improvement. Okay, here's another Catesby. By contrast, the bobolink, also called the rice bird, as Catesby refers to it, is illustrated alongside a stem of rice, a female perched gently atop it and holding a single grain of rice in her mouth, and the male bent beneath it, pecking at the ground. We might even deduce that Catesby chose to refer to the bobolink as rice bird in the text to specifically emphasize its association with rice, which was a European importation, since onomatopoeic names are often the oldest names in circulation for birds. So these birds' bodies curve in symmetric alignment with the bending stem of the plant, implying a natural unity between these species, the message, of course, being that the European importation of rice to the Carolinas was of benefit both economically and also for the less menacing wildlife of the region, like the bobolink. Okay. So some of the more notable authors to follow in the wake of Catesby were Alexander Wilson and John James Audubon. Even though Wilson, Audubon, and others wrote, illustrated, and explored, lacking any direct connection or obligation to the monarchy, the Catesbian orientation toward the environment was largely maintained. Speaking broadly about Wilson's work, what made him famous is that he was very detailed, accurate, and thorough. He was much more scientifically accurate than Catesby or others like Catesby, and his work included most of the birds in the area he covered. He was the most thorough up to that point. An interesting thing that was going on at that time was that American naturalists, and William Bartram is a really good example of this, but I'm not talking about him in this presentation, were occupied with refuting Comte de Buffon's degeneracy theory, which basically stated that American animals were smaller, weaker, and more degenerate versions of European wildlife. Thomas Jefferson wrote about this in Notes on the State of West Virginia extensively. And tied up in that effort was a desire to affirm the validity and robustness of a new nation. American naturalists felt like they had to prove and validate American natural history study and nationhood in contrast to European natural history. So there's a plate here of 3 Western species, because part of what happened during Wilson's time is that the Louisiana Purchase occurred. So these are 3 species that were added to his collection when that huge territory that was controlled by France became part of the United States. Okay, so in John James Audubon work, there's still something of a colonial orientation toward American nature. You can see that in his ornithological biography, which is perhaps best understood as a textual companion to the work Audubon is most famous for, which is The Birds of America, a portfolio of large print canvases of his artwork, effectively providing the narration for the adventure of compiling The Birds of America. So ornithological biography opens with a really dramatic section where he crosses the great ocean to arrive upon noble forests so he can discover the purpose and import of that nature. So from the outset, Audubon frames his ornithological quest as a reimagining of European colonization of the American wilderness, even though he was born in the Americas, since he was born in Haiti, which at that time was a French colony. So in all his life and works, Audubon really loved to play up the idea of America as wilderness. That was very important to his success. Another important thing to touch on with the Birds of America was that it was for the same audience as his predecessors. His audience was really like an elite upper class, as well as large institutions that could afford this book, which was a very expensive book, like museums. In large part, that's due to the technologies that were available at the time. Books were very expensive to produce because paper was handmade and printing presses were hand cranked. Plus, the Birds of America was more difficult to produce than normal because of its immense size, something that Audubon always insisted on, and thus only people with a lot of money could afford it. Famously, the illustrations of the Birds of America were lifelike. The birds, even though they were dead, and he was a hunter, he would kill the birds. He would kill the birds and then he would pose them using like barbed wire, essentially, and then he would paint them. And he would do this in the field. That's what he was famous for. That's really what distinguishes, or one of the things he's famous for. That's really what distinguishes his work from someone like Wilson. Wilson was more working from stuffed, from like skins of birds. Audubon would paint birds in the field, so they were like only recently dead, and he would pose them. So that's why Audubon's artwork is sort of known for being more vibrant and alive, somewhat ironic. More than the portrayals of other artists. So that might seem maybe not so impressive to us today because we're so saturated in photos and art of most life forms that we're interested in. It's really rare that there are animals, plants, etc., that we don't really have pictures and art of. But at that time, that was just incredibly noteworthy. And this plate here is the northern mockingbird, and you can see like this is one of the ones that's it's just very, very dramatic. It's very, very Audubon-esque. There's a rattlesnake climbing up a tree to like raid a mockingbird nest, and the mockingbirds are trying to fight them off. And Tuan especially will probably appreciate this, in that rattlesnakes don't do that. Rattlesnakes don't climb trees. They're ground dwellers. But like Audubon, in most cases, Audubon was like pretty accurate scientifically, but this one there's like an embellishment, so to speak. But the drama is what makes it, right? And that's part of what made his art so spectacular and so beloved. Okay, so let's see. So another one of the hallmarks of Audubon's work that I mentioned briefly was that he absolutely insisted on always depicting birds on the page to their actual size, which is why The Birds of America was an absolutely enormous book. At the time of its printing, it weighed 40 pounds, which at that time was the heaviest book ever produced. So the most interesting way one of the really interesting ways, there's a lot to say about that, but one of the really interesting ways that played out was with birds that were too large to fit on the page of the largest pages that could be produced in the world. He had to produce his work in London because it was the only place that had a printing press that it could accommodate his super large pages. So some birds, most birds are not super big and can fit on a page, but some can. Like some birds are really quite big. So I have 3 examples here of the great blue heron, the whooping crane, and the American flamingo. So that's why their bodies appear like contorted. That's what he would have to do to get them to fit on the page. So they're posed in different and interesting ways. And that was another way in which Audubon's work was like, it just added to the drama in it to have these birds contorted in different ways. There were other reasons for Audubon's popularity. He was really a showman. He very much played up the frontier aspect of American nature. He would wear a buckskin jacket and coonskin hat, even at like formal events. And Europeans just loved that. He knew how to sell his work. And part of that was to sell himself as like a frontier guy. So to sum up, the proto-field guide era. Proto-field guides or early natural history texts were about assigning names to things through the Linnaean system as comprehensively as possible, and generally depicting America as a wilderness that was ripe for exploration and also exploitation, even when it wasn't that much of a wilderness anymore. Audubon's work in particular was incredibly popular among his potential audience of aristocrats and merchants, partly because of the beauty of the art, but also partly because of how he successfully played into ideas about America and American nature. Okay, so here is what I label in my work as the second era of the field guides, the first field guides. So in the late 19th century, the books that are largely cited as the first field guides were authored, although what constitutes the first field guide, that's actually a disputed space. There is a scholar named Sarah Scharf that claims the first field guides were botanical identification manuals developed in post-Napoleonic France, for instance. The late 19th century books, the ones usually touted as the first field guides, they did a lot of different things. They did a lot of things differently than some of the predecessors, like the proto-field guides. The purpose of these books became more the development and encouragement of natural history study for amateurs and hobbyists. This is an important era. Bird study or bird watching and what we now think of as birding, as well as other natural history hobbies, were promoted as a pursuit that were appropriate for children and adults because they yielded good health and good morals rather than being an elitist enterprise of aristocracy, preoccupied with desire to exert some hierarchical control. So here are some of the things that were going on at the time. Women were still not able to vote, but women found that they were able to exert influence in the public sphere by using their association with and authority over domestic spaces as a means to enter conversations about broader issues. So authors like Florence Merriam Bailey, also Mabel Osgood Wright, Olive Thorne Miller, Jean Stratton Porter, Anne Comstock, and others could write books that were on the surface mostly about gardens, including bird and plant life often found in gardens, but carried much broader implications and applications for conservation efforts outside gardens, while also exerting influence on cultural conventions of the time. So there is another important circumstance to consider from that time in 1890, which is right when these books started appearing. That's when Birds Through an Opera Glass, which many people cite as the first field guide, was published. That's when the frontier closed, the American frontier. So it was the perfect moment for a kind of new environmental orientation, something distinct from the colonial westward expanding mindset of the first era. So today we take for granted that anyone can become a naturalist or a birder and even study birds and natural history seriously and contribute to citizen science. But these authors were the first people to really circulate that idea and make it popular. The methods of conservation pursued by birders and other naturalists today have become culturally entrenched, owing in very large part to the values championed by these writers. Let's see, another important thing to keep in mind from this era is that machine-made paper had recently replaced handmade, and printing presses were no longer hand cranked, but steam powered. So that made making books easier and cheaper. So meanwhile, with the renewed push westward following the Civil War, the American Civil War, there was an expanded railroad network throughout the nation, which helped bring more books to more people. So many of these first field guides were authored by women, and not all of them, but many of them were, and they had a domestic orientation rather than continental. So there are a lot of stylistic hallmarks to these books. They often included lyric and really embellished descriptions of birds and other wildlife, and they had a very didactic tone regarding bird study and conservation as a form of moral improvement. They'll say quite explicitly, if you study birds and learn the birds and the other animals and plant life around you, that makes you a better person, and it's a good way to make children into better people. They say that, like we kind of like, a lot of birders and naturalists feel that way now, but we don't explicitly like say it, and you really don't find that kind of language in field guides, or you typically don't. But that was like really prevalent at that time, which I think is very interesting. A lot of times these authors advocated for learning bird songs, sometimes even first before site identification, which was different than what was emphasized before them and also immediately after them. So another important thing to note about this is that about this time period is that the environmental advocacy championed by these authors and books, it actually resulted in environmental jobs and professions that didn't exist before, like forester and some other kind of careers like that. But those jobs could only be filled by men. And so the influence that these women had created for themselves was pretty quickly lost and supplanted by male influence. These authors made birding a middle-class hobby and made bird and environmental conservation a middle-class virtue. Both activities were thought of as healthy and good for personal development, those are values that we still carry with us today. Mabel Osgood Wright's Birdcraft was also a very popular book. This is another one, Neltje Blanchan's Birds Every Child Should Know. So it's very explicitly, it's like a manual for parenting almost. That's a really interesting one too. Okay, so we're on to the man himself. The third era, this is the Modern Field Guide. This is a copy of the first edition or a photo of the first edition of Roger Tory Peterson's A Field Guide to the Birds. When Roger Tory Peterson published Field Guide to the Birds in 1934, the field guide genre changed again, and it changed forever. Many of us know that Peterson's main innovation, in simplest terms, was to boil down visual bird identification to its simplest possible formula with the aid of arrows and composite illustrations, which became wildly popular, even though it was published during the Depression. So the first field guides had been around for a while, and it was kind of like a good cultural moment for a new vision of what field guides could be. But it was also the right technological moment. Automated presses had only recently been invented, and bird books became something for the millions, expanding beyond just the middle class. That's one of the things that's been the most interesting for me about my project as I've researched it is I did know a lot about field guides before I started the project and about nature and environmental writing in general, but I didn't know so much about the history of printing presses, and that has been an important factor in learning about how these different books and authors were able to carve out their cultural space that they occupy. So the hobby exploded in popularity, and birding began its ascent as a widespread pastime, increasingly less ostracized from mainstream culture. The primary transformation of the hobby itself as a consequence of Peterson's work was a value shift. Birding became about rapid and accurate identification of birds in the field. Books advocated for intense sensory training of the eyes, although this has changed a lot in the last few decades. Peterson even goes so far as to declare sight's primacy over sound in the birding hobby, which is a little different than the authors who wrote before him, at least some of them. He wrote, this is from the first book, the first edition. We make our first identification of a species as a rule by sight. Then we become familiar with its song or notes. So yet there are many birds that are more easily detected by sound, and it's not difficult to imagine a person, for instance, intimately familiar with the sound of a wood thrush, but with no idea how to identify it visually. So that's really quite a change from some of the authors that came before him. So a big part of the Petersonian move was to emphasize field identification and to spend less textual space on other values of birding, at least explicitly. So appreciation, conservation, good personal health, those are things that you can see and read in books before him that they're not so present in Peterson's writing. That some of his immediate predecessors would write, rapid and accurate field identification achieved through clear visual recognition of a bird was positioned as the primary objective of birding, with other considerations not necessarily dismissed, but relegated as beyond the purview of an effective field guide. To accomplish this goal, Peterson explicitly directs his readers to focus their attention on the visual aspects of a bird. His style borrows from rationality, from scientific and professional study, and applies it to the identification aspect of the hobby. So I have here a line that is pretty revelatory. It is the discovery of rarities that puts real zest into the sport of birding, a zest that many of us would like to interpret as scientific zeal rather than the quickening of our sporting blood. So the thrill of discovery, that's the quote, the thrill of discovering something rare, one of the objectives of the game, at least the way many people still play the game of birding today, is attempted to be codified as being a scientific pursuit, although it's by his own admission not really that scientific. So while Peterson wrote about joy and the good feeling associated with birding in essays, or he might have said so in speeches, he was resistant to inscribe the hobby with joy or good feeling in the field guide genre, which was really different than the first field guides. So although he did describe that stuff in essays and his nonfiction prose a lot, he was a really prolific writer. So it's just not really in his field guides. Just interesting to see that bifurcation there. Another interesting thing is, so there's one scholar who, a humanities scholar, his name is Spencer Schaffner, who has argued that modern field guides and their decoupling of birds from their environment trains field guide users to ignore environmental degradation by depicting birds as separate entities from their environment rather than enmeshed within them. So I think his argument is a bit of an overstated one. For instance, field guides are encouraging training of habitat recognition and other ecological associations too. There are field guides that are really focused on that. But I think it's worth contemplating and thinking through Schaffner's arguments that they're not totally without merit, I think. So one of the most interesting things to look at within virtually any field guide is what values are encoded within the text. I've done a lot of that already in this presentation, and I'm going to look at one more example of what I think is a really interesting example with Peterson. Virtually all Petersonian field guides, unlike their predecessors, claim to be about accurate identification and not really anything else. But I'm going to demonstrate how that's not what they're all about. Okay, so there are 7 editions. A new one just came out a few years ago of Peterson's A Field Guide to the Birds, which was essentially a field guide for birds of Eastern North America. New editions appeared in 1939, 1947, 1980, 2002, 2010, and now 2020. So if we look closely, we'll see that in these various editions of Peterson's A Field Guide to the Birds, there is a growing anxiety about the extinction of American bird species. So in the preface to the first edition, Peterson pretty clearly lays out his intention. In plain terms, Peterson wanted to create a book that could help people visually identify Eastern birds in the field. Owing to this purely utilitarian focus, it logically follows that the text would not contain any illustrations or descriptions referencing birds that were in 1934 certifiably extinct. The 3 species that fall into this category are the great auk, extinct in 1844, the Labrador duck, extinct in 1872, and the passenger pigeon, extinct in 1914. But I should note real quick that in my dissertation, I do a very thorough close reading of these editions, and this is the speedy version of that because we only have limited time. So the auk and the duck do not appear anywhere in the book, which is consistent with Peterson's declared mission. The passenger pigeon does receive textual attention in the section of the mourning dove, an abundant bird of the East, in order to dissuade overzealous birders from reporting pigeon sightings. So only one extinct bird was illustrated in the first edition. The 2 very rare but not yet extinct birds, the Eskimo curlew and the ivory-billed woodpeckers, it's a big story these days, are described in the text but not illustrated. The only bird that is both illustrated and described in the text is the one that still existed in a somewhat healthy population, the Bachman's warbler. The first edition basically is faithful to Peterson's purported claim of serving as a tool for identification. But by the third edition, published in 1947, what I call an extinction anxiety starts to take hold. The third edition still does not feature illustration or text referring to the longest extinct species in the US, the great auk and Labrador duck, but several other extinct species are more prominently featured. The Carolina parakeet gets a much more expanded description, although still not illustrated. But Peterson's lengthy textual description of the bird is odd, considering it was far less likely to still exist in 1947 than in 1934. So it makes sense only if we bear in mind Peterson's growing anxiety over the disappearance of American bird species. The other extinct species that receives a much more expanded treatment in the third edition is the ivory-billed woodpecker. Again, ivory-billed. The fourth edition, published several decades after the third in 1980, he worked on various other books and projects in between the third and fourth editions, because Peterson was really like the man, is when the extinction anxiety really becomes amplified. Among extinct species, the Labrador duck and gray duck are both, they're finely illustrated. Unlike other species which are given full body illustrations, the auk and duck are given what might best be described as like portraitures. Their heads and shoulders are painted inside a circle. You can see that with the Carolina parakeet here. The ox is notably like glamorous. It's occurring on the bottom left of the page and taking up a large degree of space on that page. For both species, the year of their extinction is listed. These details, absent from the earlier editions, have nothing to do with the identification of birds because they're extinct. We might interpret them as a form of like even self-flagellation, or maybe even a kind of commemoration, or even a kind of warning of what may happen to birds if we do not care for them. Whatever the explanation for their presence, they are manifestations of extinction anxiety at odds with the book's explicitly stated purpose. So like the fourth edition, the sixth edition, published in 2010, prominently features all of North America's extinct birds. The four indisputably extinct species are all given portraitures that visually dominate the page on which they are located. Birds that have not been seen for decades, like the Eskimo curlew and Bachman's warbler, are optimistically labeled as probably extinct and illustrated alongside similar species. The ivory-billed woodpecker, the most lamented four species, is listed as possibly extinct, despite no new definite sightings having taken place since the previous edition. The annihilation of these birds is too much to bear, and so they haunt the book as a kind of optimism. So by tracking the growing extinction anxieties in the Peterson series, it becomes clear that the purpose of the book evolves from a purely utilitarian identification aid to a form of conservation advocacy. Finally, I'll add that in the seventh edition, which came out a few years ago, it's almost the same as the sixth edition, except they did add an illustration of the passenger pigeon. Okay. So David Allen Sibley, second coming of Peterson. Probably the most famous contemporary field guide author is David Allen Sibley, which is no small feat, as the field guide market is extremely competitive and saturated with talent. Sibley, as well as most other field guide authors, still follow the Petersonian template, and when authors deviate, speaking very broadly here, from that template, they do so deliberately in an attempt to perhaps create a new niche or tap into a new potential market or something along those lines. Usually, the left side of the page of the field guide has text, and the right side has illustrations or sometimes pictures. They still use the annotation system for having like really key field marks. That Peterson basically invented that with the arrows. You can see that on a sample plate here. Field guides are getting bigger and they're getting heavier, especially for taxa that have already been portrayed a lot in field guides, like birds, but also plants. They are becoming more and more like big, heavy reference books. The way authors innovate with field guides a lot of the times has to do with how they can include more information as succinctly as possible. They're more detailed. Field guides continue to emphasize accurate identification of organisms through Linnaean taxonomy, even though Linnaean taxonomy has arguably proven to be like somewhat, it's kind of unwieldy, but like that's the way field guides make us think. They make us think through Linnaean taxonomy. Relatedly, field guides operate in they operate in like a science adjacent space. Sometimes they're authored by actual scientists, and other times they're written by highly skilled amateurs. Many of the most famous field guide authors, like Sibley, are able to illustrate as well as provide their own text. That's very much in the model of Peterson. That's totally his legacy, or part of his legacy. Sometimes there are collaborations between an artist and expert who writes the text, or sometimes there are photo field guides that can function a little differently. Authorship of some field guides is institutional, like for instance, Audubon's latest field guides for birds and trees. The author is just like Audubon, the organization. But the important thing to note related to Sibley is that, in my opinion, part of his stature is related to how he follows and he improves the model established by Peterson. Birders just like that. So Sibley's like Peterson in that he followed the Petersonian template and essentially made it like a better version and a more robust version of itself. And he's different than Peterson in that his own field guide didn't totally shake up the genre and change the way we think about field guides. As we've discussed, the Petersonian model has maintained its dominance over the field guide genre. It's still the template, although that's been somewhat challenged or complicated now by the internet and smartphone apps. That would really be, if we were going to talk about a possible fourth era of the field guide, it would be apps and automated ID. That stuff is just changing so quickly. What's it called? Like visual, like photo ID by apps has gotten really good, and now sound ID by apps, that's just like changing almost like month to month, definitely year to year. It's getting better and better, that technology. So in the Sand County Almanac, which is a classic environmental text by Aldo Leopold writes that in order to care about something, you need to know its name, and ideally not just a name as an abstraction, but coupled with in-person knowledge. So field guides not only train our senses to put names to the things around us, they are designed to propel us outside to seek out forms of living things not yet familiar to us by formatting their pages to create desire. Is not totally unlike like a consumer catalog. So we live in an era when nearly every known living bird species has been depicted in a field guide. Field guides continue to be an immensely popular genre, expanding into virtually every region of the world and every realm of natural history study, from moths to reptiles, to wildflowers, to mushrooms, to lichens, to flies, to leaf miners. So as a closing thought, I offer that the reason field guides continue to be so popular and cover new taxa and regions every day is because underlying this massive global effort to depict every living thing in a field guide is the same extinction anxiety I identified and discussed in Peterson's work. Is a desperate hope that if all people can have access to learning the names of all living things, then maybe we can, just maybe we can save them from ourselves. So thank you.
Thank you, Frank. This is really super interesting, and I have millions of questions, of course, here.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, being a field guide author myself, and I totally relate to your extinction anxiety. For those of you who are watching here, I work primarily on reptiles and amphibians, and there's been a massive crash in amphibian species in the late 1980s, early 90s, and I've kind of gone through the same phase where my initial first field guides listed all these species as extinct, and now that we're fast forward 20 years, some of these are sort of clinging at the edge of extinction. They're still out there. It's been personally a main driver to crank out more books to educate people about what's still out there, so we can train more eyes and ears on being out there and helping us get the information needed to just properly document what the current status of some of these species is, and hopefully do something about it. Obviously, that's sort of the next phase there. But it's fascinating to just sort of put all of this in a societal and a historical context to kind of think about some of these bird species that we sort of are so familiar with through the media these days, but obviously have been long gone. And so just kind of putting yourself in the shoes of the people that were there at the front line as these species were disappearing, it just kind of makes a lot of sense here. Fascinating stuff. Well, I see there's a few questions here, so if you don't mind, I'm just going to read them out to you and then you can respond. I'm not sure if you can see them yourself, so on the off chance that you can't. There's a question here from John Rum. It says, hi, Frank. Roger Tory Peterson often in his editorial notes to field guides as a who's who of birds, mammals, etc., in allusion to the who's who reference series. So on that basis, wouldn't including illustrations and depictions of extinct species simply be in line with informing readers about who is who?
Yeah, so I'm looking at that question.
Okay.
Let's see. Who's who? I'm not familiar with the Who's Who reference series, so it's a little difficult for me to answer that question. Sure, it sounds like it might be in line with that that series, but there's an entry point for the tension between including extinct species and the field guide that I found so interesting to explore is that you can't identify extinct species in the field, so because they're extinct. So when he claims that the purpose of the book is to identify extinct species, by including them in the book, it undermines the stated purpose. And so that's what I found a really interesting, like I said, entry point for sort of psychologizing and analyzing what might be going on there for him to include those extinct species. It's not, field guides are not necessarily supposed to be, they're used this way a lot, but they're not supposed to necessarily be like a catalog of extinct species or all species that have existed. There's some kind of tension there between a purported purpose and what's actually going on within the pages. So I'm gonna, let me write this down. Who's Who reference series. And it was really interesting, Tuan, to think about what you were saying as your work as a field guide author, because like, for instance, this made my project more manageable to do the really close reading of the 7 editions of Peterson and extinct species represented in that book. But I mean, there's only like 6 or 7, it depends, you know, there's a few subspecies to look at too, kinds of birds in the United States and Canada that have gone extinct. But in the neotropics, there are like tons of reptiles and amphibians that are extinct or near threatened, or people don't know. I assume they don't know. That's like, well, are they out there or not? So that makes me want to, like, part of the problem with finishing my dissertation is I always think of like something else I want to do or need to include, because field guides are so big and unwieldy. Because just so popular, it makes me want to do like a close reading of neotropical, like amphibian field guides, and maybe do a close reading of your book. Included in
I was working on an update on the amphibian guide in, I'm trying to remember exactly when it was, the early 2000s, and I had pretty much written the manuscript, and it just totally threw me in such a funk, because like there were so many species where I was writing accounts for that all ended up with like, used to be really common, used to be seen here, did this and that, hasn't been seen since the like 1980s. And the percentage of species that were gone, or that we thought were gone at the time, was so high that I literally dropped the manuscript and just didn't even want to finish it until years later. And unfortunately, at that point, a lot of the species, a lot of my work has been really on like finding those Lazarus populations, the ones that are still hanging by a thread. So if I had put that book out 10 years earlier, it would have been a completely different book than what the most recent one would have ended up. So that's really interesting. And along those lines too, like on a personal level, I like birds too, and I love field guides, but in your mind, is there a need for more field guides to the birds of North America, for example? You know, there's so many stellar works already, and you know, we know them all. There's a few added every once in a while. Something blows across the ocean and ends up somewhere, and it's big news. And then, so you can add a species to the list for the country, but substantially, it doesn't really change what's here, right? And along those lines, do you think that? So first of all, is there a need for new field guides, and if so, like what is the necessary added information that would warrant such a new field guide? Because in my mind, I think that I totally agree. I think that Sibley's guides are a real sort of second coming of Peterson. But at the same time, when people approach me often, they're like wanting to buy a field guide because they want to get into birding and they want to know what's the best field guide, right?
Right.
Sibley's guide has so much information above and beyond what Peterson displays in his books. That it's great for birders and people who know birds and really want to get into the nitty gritty. But if you're just starting out, the Sibley guides are overwhelmingly detailed. There's way more stuff there than most people can handle from scratch. Where I often, and I really still, I personally use Sibley guides just because of the added information. But when people ask me for a first entry level guide, I think the Peterson guides are a much better entry point because of their simplicity. So I'm wondering if you're actually you're not seeing a sequel in that Sibley's guide versus Peterson's, but that you're also seeing a sort of shift in which audiences are being targeted for these particular books.
Well, one thing that someone said to me once that I found fascinating, and I think about, because so I'm the editor of Birding now, Birding Magazine, and for a long time, what I used to do few years, I was the reviews editor for the magazine. So I was in charge of the column that would review books, bird books. And I just recently handed that off to someone who I think is going to be really great for the magazine. And what someone said to me once was that, because there are bird books that come out and I'm like, why, this book is so similar to this other book that already came out recently. Why does it exist? Like, isn't the market saturated with this kind of book already? And someone said to me, you cannot saturate the bird book market. People are always going to buy bird books, even if they're very similar to other books. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about, who knows what the market needs, there are unfilled niches, but the thing is, people and birders and naturalists and other kinds of hobbyists and professionals too, scientists, they love books about nature, including field guides. And there are so many people that can't get enough of them, that even marginal differences between them, or books that are just so similar in scope and intent and execution, people still buy it. Just check it out. People just love it, which is great. It's really great on its own. So with it's like you said, Tuan, it's like answering what's the best field guide. It's so hard. I like National Geographic a lot too. A lot of people pit National Geographic alongside Sibley as those are the two, especially if you want to become more of an advanced birder. And there is always that tension between what's too much information, what's too much information for a field guide, and that they keep getting bigger. So I don't know what field guides need to do. I think I don't feel like I can answer that, what direction they need to go to. I do think that the development and the evolution of apps and automated identification is very interesting and exciting. And for me personally, just as a hobby naturalist, I love using iNaturalist too. I have learned so much, not really about birds, but about the bugs in my yard and plants a lot too by using iNaturalist. So there's just a lot of exciting things happening in that space. And I think some people are worried that apps are going to supplant field guides, but I don't know. I don't really think so. Field guides are just really, really popular. I mean, we'll see. It'll be exciting to watch as that develops.
Absolutely, it is. And I love how you also highlighted sort of the advances in technology and how much those were a critical driver of the success of some of these different new books. And obviously this is the next wave of technology that's driving a new version of, I'm not even sure if you want to call it a field guide at that point. And I agree. I love the sort of crowdsourcing of information. I love that experts are at everybody's fingertips, that you have, field guides obviously are sort of a one-way stream of information, right? You open the book and you just take out of it what the author has put in there. But I think that the newer interactive ways of gathering information through iNaturalist and crowdsourcing answers and things like that, there's pros and cons for all of that. Along those lines, there's one interesting thing that we had a conversation about a little while ago at RTPI about, the advancement of technology and being able to have your pictures and your sound recordings be identified by algorithms and AI is amazing. And I certainly use some of that for my work as well. It's amazing that you can do this nowadays, but in a way that also kind of, in my mind, removes the sort of naturalist mindset that you learn field marks from a field guide so that you personally know how to recognize things rather than just holding up your phone and have your phone just do the work for you. So that in a way, the information that's available is so much more in real time. But at the same time, I wonder if it kind of takes away some of your field skills, the actual original naturalist skills of being able to recognize things yourself without your phone doing it for you. You run out of batteries and you're dead in the water.
Yeah, I've seen people bitterly argue over that, especially like in the bird world. There's like the Sound ID app now, the Merlin Sound ID. That technology is getting better and better, and a lot of birders are worried that it's going to diminish people's field skills. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I actually, like, this might be surprising, but I don't have a strong opinion. I'll just wait and see. I'm not super anxious about it. I think that when you have the automated, like the algorithmic IDs, that when you use it, I feel like it's so much of like identification is based on repetition and like pattern recognition. I know what the field marks are on a rational level for so many birds and a lot of other animals too, and plants, excuse me. But I rarely like go through them rationally. I recognize a pattern and I know it, and then I can explain it if I need to, but I recognize it first. So I don't think with the algorithms, I think people will be able, it depends on, you know, like, it depends on the will. If people want to become skilled and be able to do it on their own, they'll be able to use that technology in a way that might be very similar to field guides. So maybe there won't be a diminishment in skill, but at the same time, like I said, I don't know. Like, we'll find out. maybe people will. I don't know. I'm skeptical of people becoming like worse naturalists. I don't really. That doesn't. It just like kind of on a gut level seems like it's not really going to be the case. But I don't know. Maybe it will. I don't know. We'll see.
It'll be interesting for sure. And there's a lot of new technology that's developing, and there's a lot of interesting things to come still. So. Yeah, it's great. And I think we're running out of time here. So I think this is a good point to wrap it up. I think that you made a really great, strong, interesting, fascinating case about the value of field guides and what they've done for us over the generations. And I think it'd be really interesting to see where this is headed next. And I know you're going to be on the front line watching this. I know I will be too. So thank you again, Frank, for doing this program. It's really fascinating. And let's see, maybe we can regroup over in a few years and see where this is going.
Yeah, that sounds great, Twan. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the Roger Tory Peterson Institute for having me. It was really a pleasure and an honor to give the talk. And if I can just say one last thing, I wanted to, let me see. Oh, yes. This is the organization I work for. It's the American Birding Association. This is our magazine, Birding. This is the August issue. If anyone wants to contact me, my email is there about the presentation or ABA or anything. And we also happen to have a promotion going on where people join, they can get a free bag of coffee. So I think you might like.
Can't say no to that.
Yeah. Thank you all again very much.